Resurgence of a Black model of psychological functioning, ancient assumptions and modern physics. The worldview evidenced by ancient Africans through the Egyptian mystery system provides the theoretical framework for the proposed Black model of psychological functioning. When the ancient assumptions about the nature of reality and the knowledge that followed are presented, a definitive paradigm evolves that posits spirit, that which is known in an extrasensory fashion, is the basis of all that is. This is consistent with the personality theories of African American psychologists Naim Akbar and Joseph Baldwin, and pervading ethos of writers of Afrocentricity. The paradigm is couched in a holistic worldview. Ontologically, it assumes that reality is at once and inseparably spiritual and material. Accordingly, everything is spirit, the vital force of life, known in an extrasensory fashion as energy, consciousness, God, quarks, solitons, and so on, appearing materially or through the five senses. The ramification of this ontology is that it creates the antithesis of our assumption that what is real is what we are informed about only through the five senses. From the Bede and Nobles, we get an African concept of self that is multidimensional and consistent with the proposed model. All is spirit individually and uniquely expressed, and we are unified with all of creation, sharing its essence. The individual cannot and does not exist alone, but owes his or her very existence to other members of the tribe, including the ancestors and yet unborn. According to the Afrocentrists, the concept of self may be described as follows. I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am. I is the individual and the infinite whole. We is the individual and collective manifestation of all that is. Self includes all ancestors, the yet unborn, the entire community, and all of nature. In my being is my worth. In my being is my worth, because I am not separate, finite, and limited, but an extension of one with all that is. Consistent with this ontology is the epistemological assumption that self-knowledge is the basis of all knowledge. To understand this, we must accept that each of us is an individual and unique expression of infinite spirit. Once we realize who we are and understand that the process of learning more about ourselves becomes who we are, and external knowledge per se will then lose meaning. Suggested by Nichols and Dixon to be characteristic of the African mode of thought is that we acquire knowledge through symbolic imagery and rhythm. With this awareness, knowledge is not external, separated from self into discrete categories or discipline. It is not segmenting. I suggest that material manifestations are symbolic imagery and symbolic, that is, representations of infinite spirit. The concept of rhythm connotes the way things, ideas, and human beings fit together to form a whole, their function. It's the relationship between that which is known to be true and that which is appearing. According to Dixon, rhythm implies motion, the opposite of stillness. The analysis of isolated moments does not provide an equivalent appreciation of the movement from one moment to another. Modern physics reinforces this dynamic view. Quantum theory postulates that a subatomic particle exists only as a measurement. Relativity theory conceives of particles in terms of space-time as four-dimensional patterns in process, rather than in terms of objects. Energy is equal to mass times the speed of light squared. These aspects of modern physics illustrate a spiritual material ontology, yet contemporary Western science is still largely dependent on the assumption of classical physics. To account for all known phenomena, classical physics considers four fundamental forces: gravity, electromagnetism, weak nuclear forces, and strong nuclear forces. The need to postulate that another force accounts for phenomena that exist beyond the limits of instrumental observation is recognized by some modern physicists. According to Peltier, Einstein's theory of relativity, Bohr's principle of complementarity, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and Gödel's incompleteness theorem engender the need for a conception of reality beyond the material conception. The spiritual or extrasensory nature of materiality becomes evident. The spiritual or extrasensory nature of reality becomes evident. Von Neumann states that within a system solely concerned with purely natural, observable phenomena, reality, material reality, becomes less and less knowable as our observations become more and more refined. According to a subatomic physicist, Fritjof Capra, material conception of reality is outmoded. All particles can be transmitted into other particles that can be created from energy and vanish into energy. In this world, classical concepts such as elementary particles, material substance, or physical object have lost their meaning. The whole universe appears as a dynamic web of inseparable energy patterns. This realization is germane to the utility of the proposed paradigm, yet even the majority of scholarly proponents of this view do not value or are unaware of its relevance to daily living. Natural science constructs a probabilistic rather than absolute image of reality. An individual's brain continuously constructs probabilistic, not absolute, eternal realities. According to Peltier, the structures of perception within the brain are dependent upon the programming and distribution of holograms, stores of pieces of information from which the whole can be recounted. Of an infinity of possible perceptions, certain outcomes are pre-selected by the specific hologram of the brain. Only the most frequently occurring events that become consistent over time reinforce themselves subjectively and socially as the average state of consciousness. Of an infinity of possible perceptions, certain outcomes are pre-selected by the specific hologram of the brain. Only the most frequently occurring events that become consistent over time reinforce themselves subjectively and socially as the average state of consciousness. The concept of a hologram postulates that existence of both discrete events, nerve impulses, and continuous events, presynaptic, postsynaptic, and dendritic, slow potential waves, exist. This is analogous to Bohr's complementarity principle, which also postulates the existence of discrete events, particle states, and continuous events, wave functions, to account for all observed phenomena. Holo movement is movement from the continuous or implicate order, that is, of undivided wholeness, where many elements are holistically compressed, or unfolded, to discrete and explicit orders of distinctly separate elements. Holo movement is movement from the continuous or implicate order, that is, of undivided wholeness, where many elements are holistically compressed or unfolded, to the discrete and explicit order of distinctly separate elements. The energy that moves between the explicit and implicate orders is described by Bohr as still further inward, flowing without borders and without boundaries. It is the force that brings about the unfolding of the implicate. Another example of the consistency between the worldview of an Afrocentric paradigm and modern physics can be noted in Chu's bootstrap philosophy and the African system of identity. Bootstrap philosophy is based on the idea that the universe is a dynamic web of interrelated events or parts, all flowing from the properties of other parts. There are no fundamental entities of matter, such as building blocks of matter. According to Chu, Geltman, and Rosenfeld, each particle helps to generate other particles, which in turn generate it. The African system of identity views the individual human existence in the same way. I do not exist alone, but out of the interaction and properties of the collective, I am created by the collective, and I in turn create it. The theme, the principle of verticality, is reasserted on all levels of knowing. A hologram is an image in which the whole is written into each of the parts. For example, the genetic material for an entire system or organism is contained in the nucleus of a single cell. Consubstantiation is the sharing of the essence of the whole with each of its parts, the unity of the essential nature. S-matrix theory describes all properties of strongly interacting particles, called hadrons, in terms of reaction probabilities, and thus establishes an intimate link between particles and processes. Each reaction involves particles that link it to other reactions, and thus builds up a whole network of processes. For many of us, it may be difficult to imagine a single entity containing all other entities, and at the same time being a part of each of them. As a practical example, improvisational jazz, an African-American music form, represents the matrix very well. By incorporating elements or parts of a musical theme and its formal structure or whole, single and simultaneous improvisations express musical individuality that characterizes and derives coherence from the basic defining structure or musical form. The meaning of quantum events has a functional and symbolic relevance for larger systems in the way macro systems such as the universe have relevance for smaller systems. Infinitely small amounts of energy can affect a macro system, evidenced by triggering mechanisms in cybernetic theory or the concept of the brain as a cascade amplifier in engineering. Adams describes the solitons, which can be transmaterial. Adams describes the solitons, which can be transmaterial, spatially and temporally stable objects. They can act not only as carriers of internal quantum energy, kinetic energy, momentum, charge, spin, mass, but of living systems, information. When quantized, they are transformed into all known and yet to be known forms of energy and matter. Thus, solitons interact with the material world, and depending on their type, or global resonance structure actually determine the form of a material entity's performance. Now, the ontological and epistemological assumptions of the paradigm have been outlined. Spirit is the essence of all things. To realize this is the basis of knowledge, other words can be substituted for spirit, such as energy, God, consciousness, mind, the force, without changing the principle. Appearance, meaning appearing materially to the five senses, is only a part of reality. The essence of what is real must be known in an extrasensory fashion, or spiritual. Life created, governed, and redeemed by extrasensory transphysical reality is the reality. We presently preserve reality as in an extrasensory fashion, but tend not to acknowledge or interpret it based on that awareness. The world discerned by the senses is not an external world, but a projection of what our minds are programmed to give meaning to or label. The relationship of our perception to an external world is at best symbolic. The evidence we attribute to the senses can be accepted as evidence of the nature of an external world only to the extent that we understand the nature and role of our participation in its creation. We may speak of our senses as guides, but they have only the capacity to serve us, only to serve us. We may speak of our senses as guides, but they have only the capacity to serve us. We may speak of our senses as guides, but they have the capacity only to serve us. The mind sees, hears, smells, tastes, and feels. Nature, it has been said, is dull, soundless, senseless, and colorless. In the mind that give things their quality, their foundation, and their being, the stuff of the world is mind stuff. Following some of the theory of experimental cognitive psychology, we learn that perceptions are not passive acts in which the individual is simply an observer, but an active process wherein the perceiver can, to a degree, construct his/her perceptions. Neisser notes that a schema is that portion of the entire perceptual cycle that is internal to the perceiver, modifiable by experience, and somehow specific to what is being perceived. He compares a schema to a format in a computer programming language, which defines how information must be presented in order to be understood. Information that is not expected or in the acceptable format is ignored or misinterpreted. Einstein contends that pure logical thinking of the count and measure of five sense variety cannot yield any knowledge of the empirical world. All knowledge of reality starts from experience and ends in it, and is consequently subjective. Propositions arrived at by purely logical means are completely empty of external reality. As sense perception gives information of the external world only indirectly, we can grasp the external world by only speculative means. For example, as far as the laws of mathematics refer to reality, they are not certain. And as far as they are certain, they do not refer to material reality. Thus, the material world constitutes the whole world of experience, but not the whole world of reality.
You know, Linda, you've been discussing a Black model of psychological functioning. Let's discuss Black in the first place. You know, because for me, I've kind of moved away from Black. And you know, Black is a color, and you have certain ideas about Black that it's like all colors, and it absorbs everything else. And obviously, in some sense, white comes from black because it's a
Reflection.
manifestation, shall we say, a projection from black, where all color is. And that's one way to look at it, in terms of black. But I think that, this is one approach. This is just my thought process. I'm going back and forth with it. Using a color to determine a people doesn't say anything about the people. And it's like, okay, there was one time we were called, Negroes in some sense, and that may be a scientific term. Of course, there was the pejorative use of that, and we wouldn't use the word itself. But those are labels. The reality of who we are is that we're African. So personally, I like to be called African. Personally, I consider myself to be an African person, and I claim the history and the traditions of Africa, which gives me a wealth of ideas, philosophy, traditions, the longest history in the world. I belong to the original people of the world and so on. So I take great pride in calling myself an African. And I think where we're going with the model that we're talking about in terms of psychological functioning, it's an African model. Its roots are in Africa. Let's go back and forth with Black and Africanism. And I know, obviously, your book is 20 years old, 30 years old.
It is true.
Huh?
It is true. So initially,
Yeah, go ahead.
30-some years ago, the book's entitled Understanding an Afrocentric Worldview.
Right. Great.
Introduction to an Optimal Psychology. But I talked about a Black model of psychological functioning. The reference for Black isn't the people, it's the consciousness.
Yeah.
So even though they called themselves, or the Greeks, I guess, called them Ethiops, meaning Black people, and many names for the continent. At that point, the entire continent was Ethiopia. But the reason I chose a Black model is because I wanted to signify a particular consciousness, which is the unity that contains and transcends oppositions, that represents the absorption of all the energies of the spectrum into one. And thus it becomes a Black consciousness, which has the capacity to do that. But it is an African model as well. But it's a specific kind of African model, because at this juncture, at least in the academy, there were many Afrocentric ideas and many definitions of what even it meant to be African. And so I wanted the oneness model to represent a consciousness. I was of the generation when Black consciousness made sense. Many people thought it was the people, but Black consciousness is still essential and foundational to our liberation as Black people.
Well, again, I would call it African consciousness, Black consciousness. But I think there was a period, of course, in terms of, let's say, for example, the Harlem Renaissance, the rising up of Black consciousness. The same thing in South Africa, Steve Biko, Black consciousness, flowing all over the African continent and so on. So, this is understandable. And that's what it means, whatever word you use, so to speak. We're talking about, a consciousness. Now, in terms of the model, let's say mainstream psychology or philosophy doesn't seem to indicate an African model, and gives pride of origin to everything Greek, supposes that everything started with the Greeks.
Right.
So in order to talk about an African model, I think we have to talk about the extent to which the model was there. Before there was any such thing that could be called Greek civilization. And the reality of the early Greeks who were going to become civilized, shall we say, going to Africa to learn exactly what civilization was all about. In that, Egypt itself, Kemet itself, has had a 4,000-year history. At this point, it's a 6,000-year history. Of course, the latter part of it is Arab history, but in terms of it being African history, it's a 4,000-year history before the Greeks. And then if we look at what the Kemetic people said about themselves, they have a prehistory that goes back 40,000 years. That is down over time. So we have a civilization of 40,000+ years of understanding of who we are as people. And then the Greeks came to learn. And of course, as you indicated, there's Socrates, and there's Plato, and there's Democritus, and Aristotle, and so on. And, the library at Alexandria, certainly when, Alexander ended up conquering Egypt. I call him Alexander the Greek as opposed to Alexander the Great.
I as well.
Not sure what was great about him. We know that he was, a warrior in that sense, and he was Greek, and he conquered much of the known world, shall we say, that was juxtaposed to Greece at that time. He couldn't really get all the way into India, but he did get into, northern and northeastern Africa. And then he opened up the library and the knowledge. Before that was, I think there was some entry during the Persian period when Persia had conquered Kemet. So there was that whole period of time when the Greeks were learning. And then somehow, I shouldn't say somehow, but, just to elaborate how things happened, the library was burnt down, the books were destroyed. And then we have that whole period going from the Greek Empire to the Roman Empire, and the Christian period, and the domination of Rome, and the transformation of what may be Gnostic teachings into Christianity, a Romanized Christianity. I think all that area, that period of time, let's say the first 500 years AD and a few hundred years BC, is very, very critical in terms of the transformation of what.
It's true. It is absolutely true. And I think the impact on Western culture and civilization has its roots in Africa. It's just that they didn't understand what they'd studied in the mystery schools, and therefore they weren't able to bring it back and translate it. And as a consequence, Aristotle and Socrates were both killed for introducing foreign doctrine. So the African roots of what's foundational or should be foundational to Euro-Western culture, since they misappropriated that knowledge and never assigned correct authority to the originators, has struggled ever since. We haven't seen a time in Euro-Western culture where that moral and spiritual consciousness, the spiritual acumen, the moral foundation has ever existed. Yet it's all that our ancestors wrote about and talked about and formulated in terms of how to structure society and human relationship, as well as what I'm reading above your head, the kingdom of God is within. That realization was foundational. And I'm just awestruck that people come to their human beingness with that reality, with that realization intact, and build cultural tradition around that. That's what I refer to as the wisdom tradition. And so this oneness model, this Black model, as I call it, is really grounded in culturally and historically in the classical African civilization and its evolution actually up north from Southern Africa. And we can see that that way of seeing the world and being in the world really encouraged knowing through symbolic imagery and rhythm. And so one of the challenges today, even some 30 years later, when the Euro-Western people or Euro-Western trained people try to interpret the hieroglyphs and try to interpret what that culture and civilization was like, they totally get it wrong because they don't have a consciousness that allows them to comprehend we are speaking symbolically. So they have all kinds of things attributed to ancient Nubia Kemet that absolutely are so false. The same is true in terms of the Bible. They have totally misinterpreted because they have a consciousness that interprets things literally. And their knowing is counting and measuring and quantifying. But for the African people who wrote the ancient text, their notion of knowledge was symbolic. All is representing that divine. All is here representing that divine. And so that's one of the things that people need to pay attention to, because if they begin to do their own research about ancient Kemet or classical African civilization, they'll find all kinds of things that are just so absolutely wrong and misinterpretation. So one of the reasons I wanted to develop this theory of optimal psychology is going to give people a framework for being able to look at and interpret what's being delivered to us from classical African civilization so it's understood properly versus bringing our Euro-Western training and lens to try to look at things.
I think, you know, what you just said is so important. A couple of words was misappropriate. And the emphasis is on miss. The other word is misinterpret. And again, the emphasis is on miss. So, you know, things were appropriated that were misunderstood. And then when they're talked about, they're talked about from, you might say, I hate to use the term ignorance, but I can't find another word. But they're talked about from an ignorant perspective. And then meanings are assigned to events and things said that are alien to the culture that produced them. Because when you look at the early civilization, when you look at Kemetic civilization, you know, they talk about the nature and natures. It's all about nature. It's all about learning from nature. And the nature of natures is, of course, the original cosmic force that produces all these other natures, and they're functional. And as you mentioned, in terms of being symbolic, the hieroglyphics uses symbols. And that was the sacred language. And that's why it was sacred. Because, for example, the lion represented courage. And the crocodile, you know, represents force and the ability to slaughter or to consume. And then, you know, if you look at Anubis, who is representing the canine species, and a canine can eat, you know, raw meat or undigested stuff and still digest it and make it something that's palatable or useful for their system. So that's what Anubis represents, a function of transformation.
Absolutely.
All of these things are functions. But of course, the Western mentality call them gods. and say that the Kemetic people were worshiping multiple gods, and somebody else came up with the idea of one God. I mean, this is so puerile that it's you know, it's like a crime against humanity in terms
It
of
is.
intellectual understanding of what civilization is and what true knowledge is.
Yes.
True knowledge is what you understand of creation, and creation was there for billions of years. What is it now? Is it 15 billion years?
At least.
You know what I mean? So that's what we have to learn from. And that's
Right.
what our original forefathers learned from. They learned what the tree was, you know, they learned what the dog was, they learned what the cat was, what they represented. You know, what did the snake represent in terms of its functionality, you know, and they also knew what the human being represented in terms of the human, you know, functionality. And that's the concept of the king and so on, and the pharaoh.
Yeah.
That's the highest aspect that one could aspire to, which is master of oneself and master of one's universe. It wasn't just one person, you know, but it was a whole society that was moving towards this, and that's why the story of Osar, Oset, and Heru and so on is so beautiful. It's the oldest story in the world, but
Yes.
it's the most beautiful story because it's the story of how, you know, people civilized themselves and spread it around the world, and spread it around the world through discussion and talking and exposition, you know, and teaching in terms of farming and cultivation, and in terms of music and song. I mean, you know, obviously, you know, civilizing interactions, meeting people who were uncivilized and spreading it to them with no warfare, no conquest, you know, no Ukraine, you know, no NATO.
That is so true and so important for people to understand, because one of the things we observe, Dr. Garvey, is that consciousness, that wisdom tradition that you spoke about so eloquently, actually is translated throughout the continent, even to us in the Americas. So I think about this notion of neder, or nature, and what comes to mind are the Haitian people with their beliefs, or the Yoruba, or Akan, or Zulu. They all have the same understanding, the same consciousness. And talk about following the science. African people, Black people, are the most scientific people on the planet, probably to date, because not only do they observe nature and study it, but they utilize it in a way that's helpful to humanity, as opposed to competing with that divine force as though it's outside. They understand, oh, we are one. I am really oriented to demonstrate how I can elevate my consciousness to that of the Pharaoh. And I think about one of the first symbols for God was a pregnant hippopotamus. And we think, well, pregnant hippopotamus, why would they choose that? Well, as we know, the hippopotamus is the only mammal that can live above ground and underwater. And pregnant being giving forth life, above ground, underwater, 360 degrees of knowledge. Now, isn't that brilliant? or as you talk about the jackal, that Anpu, to observe that this species can look at rotting dead meat and find the sustenance that will nourish. The same idea with the ibis, or the heron. That bird can sit and look in the murky waters of none or consciousness and grab out that which will sustain and elevate. I mean, these people were amazing in terms of their brilliance, yet the brilliance of the people has yet to be comprehended by that fragmented, suboptimal Western mindset. And so our purpose, and I'm so happy you're joining me in this conversation, Dr. Garvey, is to help people understand who we are,
Mhm.
our role in humanity, so that we can carry forward the realization
Mhm.
of our inheritance.
You know, I think that there's so much that we have to learn still from Kemet, because so much has been distorted, and that's why it's important for us to do our own research. As you know, Anthony Browder is doing a lot of his own research there in Egypt, and I think that's of extreme importance. And it's important for us to interpret the symbols, because I think that, you know, knowledge is transmitted intuitively. It's not just a matter of the words, you know. In the Western sense, knowledge comes by virtue of the word. The word has the meaning. But I think there's another aspect of knowledge, which is intuitive, which comes to you from out of the great beyond, so to speak, or
Yes.
speaks to you when you look at something. If you look at a tree or you look at an apple, you get something from it that is more than simply, okay, it's red or it's round, or, you know, or even if it tastes sweet and so on and so forth. There's more to the apple than that if you really sit with the apple and learn about it. And I think that's the source of the knowledge of the Egyptians in so many ways. You know, like, for example, the symbolism of Thoth or Tehuti, who is the wisdom deity in terms of Kemet. But is also a moon deity, you know, with the baboons and so on, and worshiping the moon and the sunrise. And what all of that means, because Ra represents the solar entity, and that's what gives us life. That's the cosmic source of energy. That's what gives us life. And the moon is a reflection of the sun. So Thoth, as the wisdom deity, is a reflection of the cosmic intelligence, you know, and you see it in the story of Osiris, when his body then was captured by Seth and cut into 14 pieces. Now I look at that and I say, now what's the symbolism of 14? Well, 14 is the waning of the moon, 14 days, you know, 28 days in the month, and 14 is the waning of the moon. I said to myself, wow, you know, but that's what it means. That Seth is the negative, the evil, shall we say, is the wisdom deteriorating over a 14-day period. You see, and then now you will get the resurrection later on over those, you know, other 14 days that will come back now to the full moon, which is Alsar, you know. So the whole thing is there, but you really have to sit with it and unpack it, you know. But, you know, Linda, another thing that you began to deal with is that science now has begun to sort of catch up, shall we say, with the perspective of the ancients. And of course, you know, as we have been mentioning, the Kemetic wisdom was transferred around the world, and we find it as the basis of Taoism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on, and also in the Americas, you know, the Incas and the Aztecs and so on. This is Quetzalcoatl. This is the basis of their wisdom, and it's all there in the old world, you know, as opposed to the new world, which is Europe, which had a misunderstanding, but maybe because of the earliness and the original state of humanity, shall we say, was experienced, as opposed to the isolation during the Ice Age of the Europeans, so that they missed out on this long period of association with their origins. Anyway, I don't want to go into that as the explanation, because, you know, it's not necessarily scientific, but the point is that science now is catching up with this understanding of shall we say, something beyond just the material existence. Basically, in terms of quantum physics and so on, going, beyond the atom and beyond the electron and beyond all these different particles, getting down to whether they want to call it a quantum soup or a universal field or the Akashic field or the ether or whatever. And you mentioned the implicate and the explicate in terms of Bohr and his explanations, and these are wonderful, and the problem, I shouldn't say the problem, but science now is coming, full circle from materialistic science to a science that is, I guess you'd have to say it's based on something other than matter. At this point, I think they're still basing it on energy. They haven't quite gotten to consciousness yet, because we're still dealing with that situation, or at least moving from the paradigm where consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain, the functioning of the brain. But now we have to go to the new paradigm, which is the old paradigm, that consciousness is primary and the brain is the epiphenomenon of consciousness. but as you say, they have not been able to absorb that. Science has gotten there, but because there is not the experience of consciousness as the basis of everyday living, it is not accepted as the how should I say, the operandi, the
driver,
operating principle of humanity. And that's where your optimal psychology comes in. So I'm back to you.
Absolutely true.
Optimal psychology.
Well, the reality is that as the suboptimal worldview is pursued, and finally physicists and others, neuroscientists, have encountered matter and broken it down atomically and subatomically, finally they're beginning to acknowledge, oh my gosh, when that happens, as our observations become more and more refined, guess what we encounter? Our own consciousness. So it's been kind of a circuitous route to get there, but finally they are confirming what our ancestors already knew. Also, there's research out today that wasn't out when I first wrote this book. They have been able to discern that babies, before they're born in the womb, have consciousness. And when the body dies, there's evidence of consciousness. Now, yes, they're probably looking at a certain energy or whatever their technology can measure. But I think that the challenge, Dr. Garvey, is, so now we know, even if we know consciousness is primary, and the physicists and whomever have done confirmation of what our ancestors said, they have a long way to go, as you point out, in terms of translating that knowledge into the wisdom that can elevate humanity from the brink of destruction. So when our ancestors talked about self-knowledge as the basis of all knowledge, they knew that the self they were speaking of was this totality. And they were a part of that, and that consciousness is primary. But for people trained in the Western suboptimal mindset that's fragmented, it's difficult for them to comprehend consciousness because they don't appreciate that the reality that they're experiencing is the reality of their own creation. That is just so far for most minds missocialized into the dominant cultural worldview to comprehend, because they're so used to believing, because they've been told so often, reality is out there, and I'm just responding to what's out there. It's hard to imagine for most people that there's no out there, and that actually what I'm responding to is my own pre-programmed beliefs and assumptions about the nature of nature. And depending on how I've gotten that program, my out there will change. So with that understanding, the power we have demonstrated as Black people, as African people coming through the Ma'afa, the question that drove the development of optimal psychology for me was, how in the world do you survive? Generation after generation, 250 years of being treated like chattel with no human rights whatsoever. Clearly they had a transcendent consciousness. Clearly they had the capacity to tap into something through their intuition, because now at this point, the direct transmission of culture has been cut off. The Lakeys that I used to wear that protected me, now they're gone. My wisdom teachers are gone. The healers are gone. My language is gone. What's left? Neder. I can go within, tap into that knowledge, wisdom, understanding. We would now call it my epigenetic memory. But rather than tap into my epigenetic memory of trauma, which people like to talk about today, they tapped into their epigenetic memory of triumph, of being one with that divine force. And that then allowed them to transcend the inhumane treatment they had experienced for centuries. And if we don't really begin to pursue and understand how that happened, we're in trouble, because guess what? We're gonna have to do it again. Because the people who kidnapped and trafficked our ancestors to the Americas, their mindset hasn't changed. That's why today you see many of them trying to take away our civil rights, take away our vote, don't want the truth of our history to be taught, don't want anything that they've made up as critical race theory to be taught in elementary school, which it never was. It was always a law school curriculum. That mindset is so harmful and destructive, and to the extent we adopt it, we contribute to our own oppression. So optimal psychology is about liberating our mind, free your mind from that mental bondage. And that bondage is so deep because at the roots of it is our relationship to consciousness and realizing our capacity to define reality for ourselves. Basically, we define reality anyway, but we usually yield to someone else's definition. And to the extent it's that you're a Western definition and the definers have a suboptimal worldview, it keeps us entrapped because we're looking again outside ourselves, we're externalizing our identity, our worth, and that is devastating because it's those things that the captors of our ancestors can still control.
Yeah, and you know, it's so revealing that the scientists have gotten to the stage that they've gotten in terms of an understanding of quantum physics, shall we say, and a lot of its meaning as the ground of being. But again, it's from the perspective of measurement.
Yes.
And you know, the uncertainty of measurement, and then the potentiality and the possibilities in the quantum field or the quantum arena. There are no certainties. There is just this totipotential area, shall we say, and in some sense it's puzzling because you can't measure it, and you can't even follow it because it moves faster than the speed of light. You see, so it produces a quandary even though it moves you beyond physical matter. But where it has led them is to energy. You know, Einstein started it with like E equals mc squared. That matter was simply slow moving energy. Well, they've been able to follow this energy all the way down to its subtlest components. But the thing is that you can never dissociate consciousness from energy, because it's like a two-headed coin or two-sided coin. You know, one side may be consciousness and the other side is energy, but you can't have one without the other. You can't have consciousness that is just this so subtle that it's nothing and it can do nothing, because without energy it couldn't do anything. You see, but consciousness and energy go together, because consciousness can direct energy. Now, the thing about consciousness is you can't measure it. The only way you can know consciousness is to experience it. And there is no methodology in the West to experience consciousness. They've never come up with a methodology to do that. There is nothing. There have been methodologies in Africa for all these 1,000 years that we have talked about, and in India, and in China, and in Native America. But there's nothing in so-called Western civilization, or even in Western psychology, as a method for you to then experience consciousness.
It is true.
All of the methods have been relative to consciousness as how the brain functions. And you know, you can trace it back to all your psychologists, whether it's Jung or you know, or whoever, you know, coming up with their different theories of Freud and so on and so forth, and Sullivan and what have you. But it's all that brain function. All psychology became brain function, instead of what it was supposed to be, which is self-knowledge, the study of mind, the science of mind, the study of self. And as you've been talking, you know, self-knowledge is the basis of all knowledge. And the reason why self-knowledge is the basis of all knowledge, because self-knowledge, it takes you beyond mind to the basis of mind. Mind is simply a functioning aspect of the brain, which is directed by consciousness. So self-knowledge takes you to consciousness.
It does.
And consciousness is the basis of everything.
It is.
So self-knowledge is the beginning of all knowledge, because at the consciousness level, you have access to everything. And that's the wisdom, and that's the wisdom deity Tehuti. It's a conscious, and he's the one that created everything out of his wisdom. He created writing, and he created mathematics, and so on and so forth. This is where creativity comes from. Your consciousness, your conscious ability to tap into cosmic consciousness. So, you know, we say Western civilization, if we want to give it that name as a civilization, it's stuck. And many of us are stuck with it. And therefore we need this paradigm that we're talking about, which is a paradigm that consciousness is primary, and that the brain is the epiphenomenon, both the brain and the body. The mind and the body are the epiphenomenon of consciousness, not the epiphenomenon of ego. Because, as you know, is a fabrication.
And a horrible fabrication. But then our ancestors were aware of it. That's what Set was about.
Exactly right.
That's what Set was about. And so Set and Heru in the battle really is the battle within us between the suboptimal and the optimal. We know the optimal is going to triumph, but how much do we have to go through till we elevate our consciousness to that realization? I love, because Tahuti was very clear, all is mind, and looking at Netter or looking at nature, even the Western mindset with its fragmentation has noticed that as you break down the material aspect, you can't even decide if a thing is a particle or a wave.
Yeah.
And it's going to depend on how you're looking at it, whether it appears to be a particle or a wave. That inherently says, there's another force here that isn't out there. It's how I am looking at it. How am I shifting my perception? And that says to me, there's tremendous power that our ancestors understood, and everything that they were about was about depthful understanding of consciousness and of our true self, and illuminating our soul. That wisdom tradition, at some level, is not a scientific tradition based on a science that's external, but based on a science that is internal, that looks at self and opens up to that which is greater than ego. And you know, Dr. Garvey, I know you know this, but just for our listeners, until you get rid of ego, you're not going anywhere. Because that ego has you trapped in a presumption of yourself that's separate from the divine, that's separate from God. And then you get all hung up in personality issues. We saw this, I hate to bring it up, but we saw this with Will Smith at the Oscars. His ego just took over. And in such a way that he was out of control.
Yeah.
And when we elevate our consciousness to be in union with our true self, our divine self, and that self-knowledge allows us to see, no matter what anybody does to me, they can't inferiorize me. They have no power to diminish me. What can they do? When you come to full realization of who you are as divine spirit manifesting, then you automatically have what I say, a buffer. You build up a inoculation so you can prevent some of that toxicity and the pathology within which we are forced to exist in this society from killing us and taking over us. So there's so much to be said by really studying self-knowledge, and really studying this notion of wisdom. Even Eurocentric education kind of gets a glimpse every now and then that this really should be about wisdom, but then they don't ever do anything with it. But for the African mind, it's all about wisdom. Reason applied to careful observation yields wisdom. And the reason that we're using isn't grounded in any myth of objectivity. No. In fact, we're totally embracing the subjective nature of human consciousness, and embracing it because we know that subjective nature isn't my ego personality. The subjective nature that I'm embracing is my divine self. I'm so proud of our ancestors. They were so brilliant. Beautiful. And what I want our audience to know is we are them. We are them. We're back again to share and to teach.
Well,
and to live and uplift.
You start out talking about the oneness, and that's what's important in terms of understanding. When you get to self-knowledge, you get to oneness, because what we are involved with is dualistic thinking, meaning self and other. And of course, self is ego. And that's the ego that we've structured, from childhood. That's the ego that the society has structured for us and has helped us to structure. And says, you must behave this way, or you must do this, or you must think this way, or you must believe that. And that is all integrated into your ego structure. And that's how you manipulate your way within the society to be successful or not successful, or even to change the society and to benefit you. And that's how you end up with all of the problems that we have in terms of competition, because of course with an ego-based psychology, it's all about individualism. And if it's about individualism, then it's about competition. And if it's about our competition, then I really don't care about you. I care about me. And I must get as much of whatever it is that's out there that I consider to be useful for me. And I gather it up for myself. So we can see how this individualism and ego-structured psychology plays itself out in the competition of the workplace, in international competition, your resources or your land, I grab it, or I come to your country and I discover you. I mean, how can you discover me when I've been here all the time? But it's the ego perspective that you didn't exist until I saw you. You see, and whatever I see is mine. If I can grab it by force or trickery or any other way, and that's how you climb up the corporate ladder or what have you. So ego really, as we say, it's set, is the cause of all of the negative things that we see within society, both for the individual in terms of anxiety, in terms of frustration, in terms of fear, and as national policy in terms of the wars and the subversion and regime change that is espoused by Western countries and so on and so forth, and the grabbing of other areas that we've seen in Africa and the Americas and in Australia. It's responsible for all that. And we go back to, what you were mentioning, that ego is Seth. And we have that beautiful story, which is the oldest story ever told. And it's a story of Osar, Oset, Seth, and Heru, as well as Nephthys. And this is, it is really a psychological story of good versus evil, if you will, or ego, and dualistic thinking versus oneness.
Yes.
And a manifestation of that oneness, which is consciousness. And then how you manifest that is ma'at. I mean, obviously we can't unpack all of that here, but just briefly, the story is that Osar was our eponymous ancestor who civilized himself and civilized Kemet and the earliest people on planet Earth. And then, traveled around the world, civilizing everybody else. And then left Kemet to Auset, his wife, in charge. And everything was running smoothly. But Seth, who was his brother, younger brother, wanted to usurp the throne. So when Osar came back from his travels, he tricked him and I won't go through the whole thing, but put him in a coffin, sealed the lid, and threw him in the Nile, and took over. And of course, because he was violent and because he was subject to fragmented thinking and so on, the civilization broke down. But anyway, Auset searched for Osar, and of course, Auset really represents consciousness. The sort of physical consciousness that we use every day. Osar represents the deep consciousness, which is the wisdom side of our nature. And that's why the two of them work together as a unit, the deep consciousness and the superficial consciousness, which functions in a materialistic environment. So anyway, she found the coffin, etc. But then Seth came and also found the coffin and cut Osar up into 14 pieces, which we talked about earlier on. And this had to do with the fragmentation of consciousness. You see, the downside of the moon, which is a reflection of God. So, but Auset collected the pieces and had an immaculate conception with a remembered. And that's the key, remembering who you are. And there's a Zen koan. Can you remember your original face before you were born? Which is beautiful. And that's one of the things we have to remember, who we were before we were born, before our mothers and fathers even. Because that is the continuation of our consciousness into this particular, lifetime. But in any way, she gave birth to Heru. no, and then she nurtured Heru in the swamps and so on, in the marshes of northern Egypt, until he was a strong, young man. Now that he could fight Seth to regain the throne, because Seth had usurped the throne. And in doing this, what Heru represents is concentrated awareness, because as we mentioned, that at that outset is the awareness of consciousness on a day-to-day basis, in terms of your normal activities. So now this consciousness was concentrated and focused and could fight Seth, which is all those evil things that you had accumulated, meaning your habitual patterns and the belief systems and so on, and defeated Seth, which is really ego, defeated Seth, and then transformed Nephthys, which is what we sometimes call mind, which is only a part of what really mind is supposed to be, with the habitual patterns and so on, and the belief system. And once Heru had defeated Seth and transformed Nephthys into Heru, his companion, then he was able now to resurrect Elsar. And resurrecting Elsar means the oneness with universal or cosmic consciousness. And this is, this is the totality of self-knowledge and all that you have to go through. And this is not even recognized, shall we say, as the beginning of the wisdom teachings. And, it has come down to us as some sort of hermetic thing, and it's all hermeticism, and it's all been watered down, and but this was there before Vedanta, before Hinduism, before Taoism, before all of these things that, we look to India and say, oh, that is the land of this mystical teachings and so on and so forth. But it's right there in Kemet.
Absolutely. We don't understand that it was the Dravidians, the Africans, who went to what is now India and brought the teachings. Just like we don't understand it was the Shang dynasty that went to China and brought the teachings. So we have a rightful reason to claim all of this knowledge. All this was because it's teaching the same thing in different geographic locations and times and spaces. But the story is the same story, and it's universal. It's not that our ancestors didn't observe something that is universal in terms of humanity and human functioning and the elevation of human consciousness to be in union and oneness. So hopefully we can help expand human consciousness so that we can return to our true identities. And earlier on, Dr. Garvey, you talked about creativity. And what people oftentimes don't understand is your creativity is going to be locked up until you get some peace. Peace, well, I should say it this way. Positive creativity is going to be locked up until you're coming from a place of peace. And you can only really get to a place of peace that's sustainable when you elevate your knowledge of self to the place it's not going to be up and down based on what's going on in the material realm. Black people in particular, African people in particular, cannot afford to internalize that fragmented suboptimal view of our colonizers and our captors. We really have to reject it and really stand on this brilliant and beautiful knowledge, wisdom, and understanding that's been passed on to us through history, and through our cultural traditions. So I am so excited. These conversations are so wonderful. I hope that our audience is enjoying them as much as I am.
Well, I'm enjoying them too, and I think we've given them a mouthful today. But I certainly look forward to carrying this, further down the road.
Yes.
As we've just said, that the original teachings have been carried around the world and in some senses misunderstood and misapplied. And we have to bring it full circle to us in the West, where it has come through Judaism and through Christianity. So we do have to go there as we go down the road. But I've enjoyed this session tremendously.
Yes.
Look forward to the next one.
Likewise. Please join us again next time. Peace and blessings.